Guys, well, welcome back. This is part two of our impacts and abatement talk. Just a quick recap of what we discussed yesterday. We got into some new economic impact data. We also went over just some general impacts. We know wild pigs are wreaking havoc on the landscape in a variety of ways. Translated that a little bit more into control techniques and broke them down between our non-lethal control techniques and then our lethal control techniques. And we did address the non-lethal control techniques yesterday. And now we're going to get into the lethal control options for wild pigs in the state of Texas. And so what we're looking at right here is currently our legal options for wild pigs in Texas. And you guys can see that we have trapping, snaring, shooting, aerial gunning, and the use of trained dogs. We do not have a toxicant labeled for use here in Texas or the United States. By all accounts, by this time this year, it was indicated to me that sodium nitrite would even possibly be labeled by August of 2020. And, COVID put the brakes on a lot of things. And certainly toxicants in the wild pig world, it seems to have done the same. So I do have a few things to talk about toxicants later today, but just to be honest with you guys, I have very little new information and I'm really not sure what's been going on, especially since the start of the COVID thing. So we don't see toxicants labeled for use. What I'm going to suggest to you guys today is looking at these options. We have trapping, snaring, shooting, aerial gunning, and the use of trained dogs. I'd like to suggest that we think about these lethal tools in terms of tools of population reduction and tools of pressure. And so of the five that we see here, there are two methods that are research proven to be independently capable of reducing populations. And those two are trapping and aerial gunning. Research has been out on this for quite a while. And snaring, shooting, and trained dogs. Now, these are generally tools that are more aptly directed as tools of pressure, tools to direct animal movements, and tools that can be used to reduce damages. We talked yesterday about sometimes the name of the game is not always population reduction. Sometimes, depending on your situation, it may not be feasible to have aerial gunning. It may not be feasible to have trapping. In these cases, we can look towards our tools of pressure to direct animal movements. And I'll expound on that as we proceed through this, but just keep that in the back of your mind as we proceed. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump into it. Okay, also, I forgot about this one. I wanted to provide a laws and regulations update for wild pigs in the state of Texas. And in this particular case, the update is that there is no update. Nothing has changed since September 1, 2019. And the big thing that did change then was that no hunting license was required from that point on to hunt and pursue wild pigs in the state of Texas on private property as long as you had landowner authorization and permission. This is a pretty unique deal. I think we're one of the only states in the United States that's doing something like this. The hunter education requirements still do apply. You do have to have hunter education if you are required to do so. But since September 1, 2019, residents and non-residents, nobody has needed a hunting license any longer to pursue wild pigs. This is pretty unique because what that means is that folks from California, folks from New York, folks from anywhere in the United States can now come to Texas and no longer have to pay some of the highest non-resident hunting fees in the United States today. I mean, and as I understand it too, this applies to international hunters as well. So if you're coming from Canada, anywhere, you do not need a license in the state of Texas any longer, provided that you're following all the other laws like no trespassing, shooting across roadways, adhering to city limit guidelines and things like that. The only exception being is that if you're participating in the Texas public hunting program, meaning if you're doing the state park hunts, if you're doing the WMA hunts, no matter what you're after there, you do have to have a hunting license. But aside from that, Texas makes it very easy to recreationally pursue wild pigs through hunting. and recreational efforts. And it is, let's make no mistake, a species that we can pursue 24/7, 7 days a week, day and night, no bag limit, no season. That is an attractive thing in the state of Texas. That's an attractive thing for a lot of wildlife managers and wildlife operations. And the fact that nobody needs a hunting license anymore makes it that much easier for folks to get in there and get after wild pigs. But we're going to talk about shooting first, right? I mean, you asked 9 out of 10 Texans, what's the best way to go after wild pigs, and they're going to say, well, shooting, in my 30-06. And a lot of folks are surprised to learn that generally shooting and hunting of any kind is a low harvest method. It is generally proven to not be capable, independently capable of reducing populations. However, this is one of our most effective techniques that we have for directing animal movements and reducing damages. Um, I do want to say too, when we talk about the research, when we talk about the different control techniques, and I say, oh, research says this and research says that, I want to point out that there's always exceptions. For example, I know some guys in South Texas, some ex-military guys that get out there on these big fields at night with suppressors, night vision, thermal. They're in groups of 8 to 10 or more. These guys are military trained. And they're pulling 40, 50, 60, 80, sometimes 100 hogs a night. And it's hard for me, even though I do look into all this research and am reinforced by that, it's hard for me to believe that those folks aren't in fact reducing populations. But we talked about shooting as a very powerful tool of pressure, and the research does affirm that. As a matter of fact, this particular study found that agricultural damage in areas open to hunting was less than half than in unhunted areas, meaning that just through strategic shooting and hunting alone, you can potentially significantly reduce your agricultural damages and direct animal movements and cause those animals to abandon areas where they're causing damage. The catch here is this. Pigs are usually, they're considered a diurnal and nocturnal species, right? And so, they will run around in the daytime, particularly when we have cooler weather, wetter weather. But if you start shooting at pigs in the daytime, one of the things that happens almost immediately is they won't abandon that area. They'll just come back at 2 in the morning, maybe 10:30 at night, 11 o'clock at night, and continue to wreak havoc and cause damage. So in order for this technique to be effective at reducing damages, particularly to the scale that we're speaking of here to this research, we need to be prepared to enact both daytime and nighttime strategic shooting efforts. Because you start putting pressure on them in the day, they're certainly going to go nocturnal, but you start putting that nighttime pressure on them, that daytime pressure on them, you keep that up. Of course, you're going to reduce some numbers, but generally what's going to happen is those pigs will abandon that area. And you can save a lot of crops that way, and you can save a lot of ag damage that way. And this is probably the way that I would suggest how we think about shooting as a tool in wild pig management. Because certainly there are folks out there doing a lot of good and reducing populations, but those are pretty rare circumstances. And for the rest of us, we can look at this as a tool to reduce damage. I had mentioned that Texas makes it pretty easy to pursue wild pigs recreationally. And, technically everything that you are seeing here is currently legal in the state of Texas, right? You can go after wild pigs from UTVs, even from vehicles, as long as you are on a private roadway, meaning on your ranch road and no public roadway. Um, Artificial lighting is certainly allowed. Unplugged shotguns, just about as big of a clip for whatever firearm you want, is 100% usable. One note that I will make to this is that if you are going to be spotlighting hogs, if you are going to be using artificial lighting, if you are going to be going after them at night, a lot of Texas game wardens really do appreciate a courtesy call, meaning, call your game warden up, let them know, hey, we're going to be doing some spotlighting, we're going to be doing some artificial lighting stuff. We're going to be applying pressure to our ag fields at night. Just give them that heads up so that they don't think that you're out there poaching deer. which actually is a significant problem in Texas, particularly during deer season, when a lot of folks will say that they're hog hunting and that kind of thing. But after what we just learned about strategic shooting as a tool in general, this may not be the best option, particularly if we're looking to reduce populations. Now, we said that trapping and aerial gunning are the two tools that are independently capable of reducing populations. And for most of us, those are the tools that we want to look at and we want to look at first. I took a look back at successful eradication studies over the last 80 years or so. And unequivocally, in almost every circumstance, the successful eradication efforts involved intensive implementation of population reduction strategies first, meaning that the first thing that you want to look at, particularly in times of low resource availability, is things like trapping and aerial gunning. And you want to do that pretty intensively until you experience diminished success there. And then you can start looking at your tools of pressure and ultimately dogs, but also intermittently coming back in with your trapping and aerial gunning as necessary. This is kind of the model that these eradication studies have put forth, and have had a tremendous amount of success. But trapping is probably generally the most accessible tool that we have, right? For the average landowner, generally because not everybody has a helicopter and a machine gun, right? So with trapping, some of the advantages are that this is a highly effective tool, particularly at capturing large groups or sounders of wild pigs. Wild pigs run around in groups called sounders. It's kind of like a herd of buffalo or a flock of geese. And when you see a group of more than 3 or 4 pigs, usually that's going to be a sounder. And when we're trapping, we want to target that entire sounder. Usually, there are exceptions. For example, boars, the larger males and the breeding class males, they are generally solitary. And that's the time that we can pull out some of our other tools. That's the time that we can pull out box traps. But when we talk about trapping generally, we're talking about removing large numbers of individuals at a time and trying to trap at a sounder level. And I'll get into that a little bit more too as we proceed. Another advantage of trapping is the transport and sale of live wild pigs in the state of Texas. Movement and sale of wild pigs is regulated by the Texas Animal Health Commission. And currently, there are approximately 114 different facilities in Texas that will purchase your live wild pigs. Now, price per pound ranges, I've seen it in the last 4 or 5 years, I've seen it as high as 75 cents per pound. I don't believe it's anywhere near that now, and it hasn't been for some time. Right now, we're looking at 25, 30 cents per pound, and you're certainly not going to get rich by doing this. But this is a good way to offset some of your damage costs. This is a good way to offset some of your bait costs and some of the costs that it would take to control these pigs through techniques such as trapping. Another thing about trapping is that this is a great baseline to combine with other methods. I had mentioned the eradication studies and how they enacted their efforts. And usually they start with trapping and aerial gunning. And we should be looking at it the same way. We should be looking at trapping as our baseline to where we can branch out from trapping and utilize other techniques and tools as necessary. Say, for example, when resource availability becomes higher, or we experience diminished success through our trapping and aerial gunning efforts. Disadvantages of trapping, I mean, let's be honest here. It can be time intensive. It can be time intensive, particularly when we're seeking to do it the correct way. And the correct way is to target these animals at the sounder level and to utilize traps that are large enough to contain the total number of individuals that we're after. And that's usually through the process of pre-baiting and conditioning, which is something that could take a few days, a few weeks, a month, or more. But to do it correctly, we do have to pattern these pigs. We do have to give them the time to become comfortable in routinely visiting our traps prior to enacting our single trap night. Executed correctly, removing an entire sounder of pigs involves only one night where we actually are setting our trap to catch. The rest of the time, we're pre-baiting and conditioning, and we're monitoring with whatever type of camera device or monitoring device you want to use. There's a variety of them out there. But when we trap, we generally want to target the entire sounder and remove as many as possible. Now, there's certainly exceptions to this. It can be difficult to do, and sometimes we have to do the best that we can. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Materials costs, the trap that you're looking at here in this slide is fairly inexpensive. You can go pretty inexpensive and be successful. You can also go very expensive and be successful as well. It's just a matter of what your needs are and what you're looking to do. But in some cases, materials costs, particularly for remote, suspended, and human activated systems, can get up there. The prices have gotten a lot better in the last couple of years, but they're still considerably higher than an animal activated system like we're looking at here. All right, another way to trap is box traps. And I want to take a few minutes to discuss box traps as a tool. That they're certainly a viable tool in wild pig management. But I'd like to tell a story of a very common situation that occurs all across Texas. And we'll tell the story of Joe Farmer and the box trap. And so, Joe Farmer, he's got a wild pig problem. He's noticed a bunch of damage in his fields. So what does he do? He goes to the local feed store, and what do they want to sell him? Usually they want to sell him a 4x8 box trap with some sort of rooter type gate system. So Joe feels pretty good about that, and he buys that system and he takes it out to his field, throws some corn in there and sets that trap to catch. Now, within maybe it's a couple of days, maybe it's the next night, but Joe is ultimately successful, and when he is successful, he catches one or two pigs. He feels pretty good about that, so he sets it to catch again. This time it takes a little longer, but he catches one or two pigs again. He keeps this up for 4, 5, 6 months, but sooner or later, what happens to Joe is all of a sudden the wild pigs will not go into that trap. He's got more wild pigs on his property than he's ever had before, only now they will not touch that box trap, and he can't figure out why he can't get a single pig to come into that trap. The reason being is this, or a few of the reasons for that could be trap aversion brought on by incomplete captures. What we mean by that is, let's talk about a sounder of wild pigs. Let's say there's 10 pigs in that sounder. Now, 10 pigs come up to the box trap. One or two of them get in there, and they even get trapped. But what happened? 8 pigs just witnessed their buddies get pulled into that box trap, and it doesn't take that happening too many times before we build up trap aversion in wild pig populations. And this has happened so many times across Texas, that there are areas in Texas where it's very difficult to get a pig to get into a trap, period, no matter what you do, no matter what kind of trap it is. Essentially, when we're trapping, we need to do our best to try to leave no witnesses, because as we spoke of yesterday, wild pigs are so intelligent that they will build up that aversion through incomplete capture. Research conducted in Georgia found that larger corral style traps are as much as 4 times more effective at removing an entire sounder of pigs, and thereby at reducing populations. Now, I want to point out, Texas A&M, myself included, I am not here to condemn box traps, okay? Box traps have a viable role in wild pig management, particularly for targeting solitary boars, smaller groups of pigs, and especially in urban and suburban areas where a lot of times you can't build a big old corral trap. You need that portability, and you do need to drive those pigs and cause them to abandon those areas. Box traps will do that. So it's all about picking the right tool for the job. And generally, what we advocate, no matter what kind of trap you're using, it needs to be large enough to contain the total number of individuals that we're after. And that is the big take home message. And so, like I said, we're not condemning box traps, and there's actually some really creative and fantastic things that we can do with box traps that make them more successful at removing wild pigs at the sounder level. What we're looking at here is an oversized modified box trap designed by a gentleman by the name of Leroy Moxagemba. This is a really awesome trap. You can see that there's a portion of the top removed for non-target species like deer and turkeys that can just hop out of there. Pigs can't because of the additional paneling there on the top. You're also seeing a fairly large entrance door, right? That can be helpful. That can be helpful, especially for particularly trap shy pigs that have been trapped at and have been a part of numerous incomplete captures, and they know pretty well that it's not a good idea to try to push through any kind of metal contraption. The same thing with the portion of the floor being removed. A lot of times, trap shy pigs, when they're walking on metal grating, that can be a pretty big indicator that they're in a pretty dangerous spot. But this trap is modified to be more successful at the sounder level. It is larger, but the benefit of it is that it still retains the portability of box traps, meaning that you can flip this thing on its side, load it in the back of the truck. You don't have to drive a T-post, and you can move it all around the ranch. And so this is another way that we can use box trapping systems. And so not condemning box traps, but it's all about picking the right tool for the job and using a trap system that is large enough to contain the total number of pigs that we're after. And for most of us, that's going to mean some sort of corral trap. But something that's very important to point out is if we're using an animal activated corral trap like this, or if we're using a box trap like this, if we don't go through the pre-baiting process, meaning that if we just take that corn or that bait and throw it in here and set this thing to catch the very first night, you'll probably catch one or two pigs, but you can result, or that effort can result in the same amount of trap aversion, and it results in the same type of incomplete capture that we're talking about with box traps. And usually, what we need to do in most cases is to pre-bait and condition those animals over time. We talked about that this is a process that could take a couple of days. I've had entire sounder of pigs come in the very first night. I don't know why, but it certainly has happened. Sometimes it takes a week, sometimes it takes 3 weeks, sometimes after an entire month of pre-bedding and conditioning, say you have 20 pigs in a sounder, and you're only able to get 18 or 17 of those pigs into that trap routinely. Oftentimes, that's the time to go ahead and set your trap to catch. That's the time to go ahead and have your single trap night. The reason being is that you probably weren't going to get the rest of those pigs in there anyway, but also we want to check that trap first thing in the morning, because a lot of times what happens is those 2 or 3 pigs that you weren't able to get into that trap, even though you removed the 17, 18, they're going to be right outside of that trap first thing in the morning. They're going to be laying up against that trap, and it's a great time to combine other methods, including the Winchester, because many times you can remove the remaining individuals in that sounder. But it's up to you, right? And this is a fluid process. You have to identify what the pigs are doing on your property. You have to identify the level of comfort that the animals have, and it's up to you to decide when is the right time to have your trap night, or in the case of a human activated system, when is the time to go ahead and drop that trap, or drop that gate rather. So just be aware that this is a process that you have to tweak over time, but also be aware that we're trying to get as many of them as we can, even if they have experienced a fair level of trap aversion through incomplete capture. The way that we monitor our pigs, the way that we know when it's time to have our trap night, I mean, this is not rocket science. We have to have some sort of camera or video capture device, and it does not have to be super expensive. A standard Bushnell or Moultrie or whatever that you can get from Walmart works just fine. Doesn't have to have 10,000 megapixels or anything. You just need to know how many pigs there are and when they're routinely visiting the trap site. Now, I like to run game cameras on video function. I feel like that in 30 seconds to 1 minute bursts, I feel like that gives me a lot better information about the animal behavior. Meaning that I get to know, as they approach that trap, are they comfortable? Are they freaked out? Is there anything about my trap setup that they don't like? Things that you really can identify when you're looking at this data through video, instead of just a still picture of a pig that you can't really tell what his or her temperament is. So that's just a suggestion to you guys, but we do need to use our game cameras in order to do that. They also have, and these are pretty cool. This is relatively new, cellular game cameras. And what these do is allow for the remote monitoring of wild pigs. And I know a lot of absentee landowners are really getting into these things. Any situation where it's going to be a week or two or a month before you can get back to the property, that doesn't mean that you have to stop trapping. In fact, you can live in Dallas and have a property in the hill country and be monitoring your pre-baited trap sites the entire time. So that way, when you know you go out to the property, you'll know when those pigs are ready to go and you can have your trap night. Um, Cell service is required, right? So you're going to have to pay that monthly cell service fee. It does capture, they do capture both still images as well as video. And they are relatively expensive compared to a standard camera. But particularly for our absentee landowners that can't get out to the property every couple of weeks or so, this is a very viable option. And I've seen a lot of folks have a lot of success with this just in the short time that they've been out. Now, human activated systems, this just happens to be a boar buster trap. I'm not endorsing, Texas A&M does not endorse boar buster, but we do endorse human activated systems like boar busters, like wireless systems, like Tusk Innovations, like the variety of ones that are out there. But they all do the same thing, right? This is a human activated system where you monitor from a remote camera into your smartphone, into your computer, and you can be at the house trapping pigs on the property, at whatever time they're there. These are very successful tools. They're considerably more expensive than an animal activated system. However, you often get what you pay for. For example, the Noble Foundation boasts capture rates in excess of 80% with their human activated system. This is significant because of the research, right? You guys have probably heard the statistic that 66% of the wild pig population needs to be removed annually just to keep the same number of pigs on the landscape. So we said we have 2 million pigs out on the landscape, so if we're removing 66%, there's still going to be 2 million pigs on the landscape. However, if you have a capture rate in excess of 66%, what that means is that you are in fact putting a dent in the population. You are reducing populations. And so this is one of the only trapping systems that boast the ability to reduce populations. But that said, executed correctly, animal activated systems can be just as successful. These just provide a little bit more ease of ability to do so. But with any type of corral trap, whether it's a human activated one, whether it's an animal activated one, we do have to have some sort of gate or funnel. In this case, we're looking at a trap that has two gates on it, which can be particularly successful along rivers and streams where the pigs are traveling up and down on both sides. It's also a good technique for trap shy pigs that don't like visual barriers and would be more likely to go in whenever they can see from one side to the other. But you're going to have some sort of panel, utility panels, or in many cases, folks are going to the hinge systems and the pin systems these days. But your mesh, no matter what kind of paneling you use, we recommend it be a 4-inch mesh or less, simply because the juveniles can squirt through if it's any larger than that. Many of the traps these days don't have T-posts, but if you'd like to use those, 4-foot T-post spacing is recommended. You can cheat on that a little bit, depending on your soil type, but if you're in any kind of loose soil, you certainly need to adhere to that recommendation. And then 5-foot panel height, right? So I worked for Parks and Wildlife for a number of years. We trapped a lot of pigs with 4-foot panels and thought we were pretty good about it at that. Then I got to A&M and they're like, man, we need to have these 5-foot panels. And I wondered why. And the answer is, this is why. It's about 130-pound sow and a 4-foot panel. Right, so you guys notice, that pig did not climb. That pig straight jumped that 4-foot panel. So that's one of the reasons why we need a little bit more height on our panels. 5 foot is good, but since we started recommending 5-foot panels, I've had numerous folks come show me videos of pigs jumping 6-foot panels. And that's why today I'm going to recommend that you use 7-foot panels minimum. No, I'm completely kidding, guys. For the most part, 5-foot panels are just fine. They work very, very well. Some pigs can get over them, but that is why it's very important after we enact our single trap night to be there first thing in the morning. For one, we don't want to allow those pigs to be in the sun because they don't have sweat glands. They will expire fairly quickly in direct sunlight, and that's not humane. But two, we don't want to give them any chance to get out. And we want to go ahead and load up those pigs or eliminate them at that time. So be there first thing in the morning, and you can also have a chance at popping any residual pigs that might be hanging out near the trap site. We're starting to run out of time here, so I'm going to fast forward and we're going to finish up with aerial gunning and a little bit about toxicants. As was mentioned earlier in the talk, aerial gunning and trapping are two methods that are independently capable of reducing populations. So if we're serious about reducing numbers and serious about reducing populations on our properties, we do want to include or try to include both an aerial gunning and trapping regimen. This is a technique that can be highly effective, but it is also expensive. So prices per hour, $800 to $1,000 plus per hour in some cases, but it has gotten a lot better in the last several years. It's coming down to $400, $500, $600 an hour, but for a lot of folks, that might be prohibitive. And so we do have a couple of options. The first option is private operations. Now, in 2011, the pork chopper bill was passed, and this bill allowed private aerial gunning operations throughout Texas. And one of the benefits of this is that oftentimes the aerial gunning operation will come out to your property for free, and in exchange for that access to your land, they will enact their control efforts for you. So that is one option, but one of the things about the private operations is oftentimes the hunters are for hire, that they've paid to come out and shoot pigs from helicopters, and a lot of times they're using semi-automatic rifles, semi-automatic center fire rifles. They may not be that proficient with it. And so we have to be aware of that. Probably a better option, whenever possible, is to utilize Texas Wildlife Services for aerial operations. Now, these guys are your county trappers, state trappers, and your federal trappers, and they do have aerial gunning operations throughout the state. Now, the counties that have a Texas Wildlife Services trapper are usually the ones that have aerial operations in that county. And in order to get a hold of these folks, you need to contact your Agricultural and Natural Resources Extension agent, and they can put you in touch with them. You can find out if there is aerial gunning, Texas Wildlife Services aerial gunning going on in your county, and you can potentially get on a flight list that way. Sometimes it can be free going through Texas Wildlife Services, but oftentimes it's at a vastly reduced rate. This is a great population reduction strategy, and certainly something to consider when we're looking to reduce populations on our property. So I wanted to just touch very briefly on the use of trained dogs. I had mentioned those eradication studies worldwide over the last 80 years or so, and as a matter of fact, all of those studies did in fact implement trained dogs, but they did it in a very specific way, meaning that they came through with their population reduction efforts first, the trapping, the aerial gunning, followed by the tools of pressure, and then more population reduction efforts, and carry that out to the point that they didn't think they had a single pig left on the area of control. And that was the time to come through with trained dogs, because this is a method that's research proven to be capable of removing residual pigs that were not able to be captured or removed any other way. So if we're looking at the research model for how to implement trained dogs, it's usually as a final tool after all other techniques have been enacted. Sodium nitrite It is the toxicant bait that we're most likely going to get at some point in the future. I really have no idea when at this point, but there has been some things that did go on with sodium nitrite last year. Haven't heard anything in a while. But I want to discuss just a little bit about those changes. Now, originally, sodium nitrite was developed as pellets, and you can see the picture of those pellets there in the background. But when we do, and if we do get sodium nitrite as a toxicant option for wild pigs in Texas, it will be a peanut butter flavored paste. Now, the peanut butter flavoring was introduced to mask the decay of the microencapsulated sodium nitrite, but also to increase the palatability. Now, in some of the original trials with the peanut butter paste, they had put some seeds and put some Milo and things like that in the paste. And in the trials, that resulted in some passerine mortality, some songbird mortality, simply from picking up those seeds. Now, they redid those trials with a new paste and bait formula that did not have any of those seeds or anything in them. I have not heard the results of that trial, but I assume, with the seeds removed, passerine mortality would be significantly reduced. But it is microencapsulated because sodium nitrite decays fairly rapidly in the environment, and this helps to prevent detection by wild pigs. As we know, they can smell very well, and they can also detect that decay in some cases, but it also increases the stability as well. So I just wanted to point out that whenever and if ever we do get sodium nitrite, it will most likely be in a paste form very similar to what we're seeing here. One of the big concerns for the use of any toxicant, including sodium nitrite, is the potential for secondary transfer to non-target species. Now, if wild pigs get poisoned on the landscape, some of the first species that are going to come across these deceased wild pigs would probably be carrion feeders like vultures. And also, potentially even coyotes and things like that. But when we consider sodium nitrite and the potential for secondary transfer, I like to take a look at this TPWD, Texas Parks and Wildlife Pen trial. Now, this was a trial that was specifically designed to examine the effects of sodium nitrite poisoned pigs on carrion feeders like vultures, specifically turkey and black vultures. And some interesting things came out of this trial. In this trial, they were exclusively, the carrion feeders rather, were exclusively fed recently deceased pigs from sodium nitrite, also directly fed the stomach contents and also the livers. And something really unique about the findings is that they resulted in no mortalities to any carrion feeder, including the turkey and black vultures. And there was really only one symptom in the turkey vultures, and that was that their heads turned purple for a short amount of time, and then very quickly they would turn back to a normal color, and they would continue to eat pigs, their livers, and stomach contents without any mortalities whatsoever. And so this speaks to a real potential for not having to be concerned with secondary transfer, at least to carrion feeders, regarding sodium nitrite as a toxicant. Um, with any toxicant, it'll have to be delivered in a species specific way, meaning that it needs to get to pigs and only pigs without having non target species like raccoons, like deers, like turkey. Passerine species, like we discussed previously, but any other species beside a wild pig, we don't need to have any access to that bait. And my last understanding of the delivery system for sodium nitrite is that it's very similar to what we're seeing here. Now, this is a system that has a 30-pound magnetic lid, and that amount of force is required for the wild pigs to be able to open it up and to reliably access the bait. But it's kind of like trapping. There will need to be a pre-baiting and conditioning period. The pigs are unlikely to just go over there and open up that magnetic container without a period of pre-baiting and conditioning, meaning that you would have to probably wire it open or keep it open, feeding a placebo bait for a certain amount of time, and then incrementally lower the door there to the point that the pigs know that the bait's in there, and they can start pushing it up and accessing it and getting into that bait. And the last I heard, the delivery system, the species-specific delivery system for sodium nitrite, will be very similar to what we're seeing here, and it will involve that pre-baiting and conditioning period. And just like we would have a single trap night, it's looking like we're also going to have a single, I guess what I'd call a hot night, where you're feeding a placebo bait for whatever that conditioning period may be, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or more. And then having just one night where the actual hot bait is in there for the pigs to access and consume. Well, guys, that's it for me. I appreciate y'all bearing with me throughout both of these talks here. I realize this one ran a little bit over, but hopefully you got some good information. And I want to point you towards some really outstanding resources created by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension and also Texas A&M NRI. You can find those free resources at wildpigs.nri.tamu.edu. You'll have access to all of our publications, tons of articles, lots of videos, just a lot of really great free wild pig educational content that's right there for you, including some of our new private land stewardship lessons. These are fully interactive courses where you can get on there and take courses on not just wild pigs, but also a variety of other species and wildlife related content. So be sure to check out that website and check out some of the things that NRI has been up to these days. Also, too, I wanted to just mention our project funding for the Wild Pig program, myself, and all the resources that we create. They're provided through a Clean Water Act 319 non-point source grant from the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board and the United States EPA. Been working with these guys for a long time. Fantastic collaborators, fantastic grantors, and certainly want to let everyone know that this is what allows NRI and the Wild Pig program to do what we do. And with that, guys, thank you so much for having me today, and I hope you learned something new about wild pigs.